At 13, she was thrown out of the house by her own father, condemned to abandonment for being pregnant. Alone, she had to fight to survive, never revealing the truth about her baby. Years later, the man who rejected her discovers something that destroys all his certainties, and when he realizes who the real father of the child was, it might be too late for forgiveness. If this story interests you, subscribe to our channel to receive all our emotional stories. Continuing. The morning sun of Chicago filtered through the silk curtains of Emily's room, illuminating a collection of teddy bears meticulously arranged on the king-size bed. The alarm clock showed 6:30, but she had been awake for hours, sitting on the bathroom floor of her suite, staring with teary eyes at the positive pregnancy test in her trembling hands. "This can't be happening," she whispered to herself, as silent tears ran down her face. Still bearing childish features, Emily was only 13, and her life, until then protected by the walls of the Anderson Smith mansion in Highland Park, was about to crumble. Outside the room, the familiar sounds of the morning routine began to intensify. The clinking of cutlery in the kitchen where Rose, the housekeeper, prepared the elaborate breakfast that Emily's father, Richard, demanded every morning. The hurried steps of her mother, Helen, probably already impeccably dressed for another day of social commitments. Emily took a deep breath, tucked the test into her school uniform pocket, and tried to compose herself in front of the mirror. Her green eyes, inherited from her father, were slightly swollen, but nothing that good makeup couldn't disguise. She had learned early on from her mother the importance of keeping up appearances. "Emily, darling, are you ready?" Helen's voice sounded from the other side of the door, making the girl startle. "Coming, Mum," she replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. At the breakfast table, Richard browsed through the financial newspaper, while Helen organized her social agenda on her tablet. Emily poked at the scrambled eggs on her plate without appetite, feeling her stomach turn with each forkful. "Emily, stop playing with your food," Helen reprimanded without taking her eyes off the screen. "It's not appropriate for a young woman of your social position to show poor manners at the table." Richard lowered his newspaper for a moment, adjusting his Italian-framed glasses to observe his daughter. "You look paler than usual, sweetheart. Are you feeling well?" "I'm just a little unwell," Emily murmured, avoiding her father's penetrating gaze. "It must be anxiety about the charity ball this weekend," Helen commented, finally raising her eyes. "After all, it will be your first official appearance in society. The Valentino dress we chose is simply stunning." Emily felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. The ball. How could she attend the ball? How could she continue pretending everything was normal? Her hands began to tremble under the table, and a drop of cold sweat trickled down her forehead. "Excuse me?" she said abruptly, rising from the table. But before she could take 2 steps, the pregnancy test slipped from her uniform pocket, falling with a dull thud onto the Persian rug in the dining room. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen let the tablet fall on the table, and Richard remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the small object that had just destroyed the perfect facade he had worked so hard to build. "What is that?" Helen's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Though she knew perfectly well the answer, Emily felt her legs weaken. She had rehearsed 1,000 ways to tell her parents, but none compared to the cruelty of that moment. The tears she had contained all morning finally overflowed. I'm pregnant," she confessed, her voice barely audible in the sepulchral silence of the room. Richard rose slowly, his imposing figure casting a shadow over his daughter. His face, normally controlled and serene, was contorted into a mask of fury and disappointment. "Do you have any idea," he began, his voice trembling with contained anger, "what this means for our family? For our reputation?" Helen brought her hands to her face, letting out a high-pitched sob. "What will people say? How will I face the ladies' charity committee, years of social work, all our prestige?" "Who is the father?" Richard demanded, his voice as sharp as steel. Emily hugged herself, feeling smaller than ever. "Luke, from the senior class." "A boy from school?" Helen practically screamed. "My God, this can't be happening, not to our family." Richard started pacing back and forth, running his hands through his impeccably groomed graying hair. His calculating mind was already assessing the damage, the consequences, the headlines that would certainly emerge when the news leaked. Richard's office was a sanctuary of mahogany and leather, where decisions that moved millions were made daily. That night, however, the decision at hand was of a much more personal and painful nature. Helen was sitting in the Italian leather armchair, her hands trembling as she held a glass of red wine, while Richard nervously paced around the room. "We cannot allow this to destroy everything we've built," he declared, his voice laden with calculating coldness. "Other shareholders, the business partners, the press, do you have any idea of the scandal this would be?" Helen took a long sip of wine, trying to calm her nerves. "Richard, she's our only daughter. And precisely because of that, she should have been more careful with our reputation," he interrupted, hitting his hand on the mahogany desk. "We raised her with every luxury, every education, and this is how she repays us." Upstairs, Emily was curled up in her bed, hugging her favorite teddy bear, hearing fragments of the discussion that echoed through the floor. Each word was like a stab in her already shattered heart. Rose, the housekeeper who had practically raised her, entered the room silently, bringing a cup of chamomile tea. Her kind eyes were misty at seeing the suffering of the girl she considered almost a daughter. "Drink this, dear," whispered Rose, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It will help calm your nerves." Emily accepted the cup with trembling hands. "Rose, what's going to happen to me?" The housekeeper opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of firm footsteps climbing the stairs. Richard and Helen entered the room, their faces marked by a decision that seemed to have cost years of their lives. "Emily," Richard began, his voice controlled but glacial, "your mother and I have talked a lot, and we've reached a conclusion." Helen remained a few steps behind her husband, her face a porcelain mask about to break. Rose, sensing the tension in the air, discreetly left the room, casting one last concerned look at Emily. "You can no longer live here," Richard declared, each word falling like a sentence. "Your presence in this house, in this situation, is a threat to everything we've built." Emily felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. "Dad, please." "You'll have until tomorrow to pack your things," he continued, ignoring the tears that began to stream down his daughter's face. "We will provide a bank account with enough money for you to establish yourself elsewhere." "Richard," Helen tried to intervene, her voice trembling. "It's best for everyone, Helen," he cut her off, turning to leave the room. "For the family, for business, for our social position." Emily looked pleadingly at her mother, seeking one last thread of hope. Helen looked away, her own tears finally escaping. "I'm sorry, darling," she murmured, following her husband out of the room. Alone, Emily felt her world completely collapse. The room that had always been her refuge now seemed suffocating, each luxury object a cruel reminder of what she was about to lose. Through the window she could see the lights of Chicago shining, indifferent to her personal drama. Rose returned to the room sometime later, finding Emily still paralyzed in the same position. Without saying a word, the housekeeper began to separate some clothes and essential items, storing them in a discreet suitcase. "I can't do much, child," said Rose, her voice choked, "but take this." She extended an envelope containing some savings she had kept for years. "It's not much, but it can help in the first few days." Emily hugged the housekeeper, sobbing against her impeccably starched apron. "What am I going to do, Rose? Where will I go?" "Trust in God, my child," replied Rose, stroking the young girl's hair. "He never gives us a burden greater than we can carry." That night, Emily didn't sleep. She observed every detail of her room, every memory of a life she was about to leave behind. The next morning, with just a suitcase of clothes and Rose's envelope, she would leave behind not just a house, but an entire life of protection and privilege. The first night on the streets of Chicago was a brutal shock for Emily. The cutting cold of the Chicago winter penetrated through the thin coat she wore, constantly reminding her of the comfort she had left behind. Sitting on a bench in Millennium Park, she observed the incessant movement of people passing by hurriedly, some casting glances of distrust or pity at the solitary teenager. The money Rose had given her seemed to burn in her pocket. She knew she needed to save every penny, but her stomach growled mercilessly. How long had it been since she'd eaten? The disastrous breakfast at the mansion seemed to have happened in another life. "First time on the street, aren't you, young lady?" A woman in her 60s carrying shopping bags stopped in front of her. Her face, marked by time, showed wisdom acquired on the hard corners of life. Emily just nodded, trying to contain the tears that threatened to fall again. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Sophie, sat down beside her on the bench. "This is no place for a girl like you to be alone," the woman continued, her kind eyes assessing the situation. Especially, her gaze discreetly rested on Emily's still imperceptible belly. "How did you—" Emily began, surprised. Mrs. Sophie gave an understanding smile. "Years of life, my child. You learn to recognize certain signs. Come with me. I know a place where you can spend the night." Emily hesitated, years of warnings about not trusting strangers echoing in her mind. But something in that woman's gaze inspired confidence, and frankly, what were her alternatives? The shelter where Mrs. Sophie took her was simple but clean. The peeling walls told stories of countless lives that had passed through there, seeking a fresh start or just a moment of rest in their journeys. "There's only space for one night," explained the shelter worker, a middle-aged woman named Claudia. "Tomorrow you'll need to find another place." Lying on the narrow bunk that night, Emily felt the weight of her new reality. The sounds were different here, distant snores, whispers, muffled cries, so different from the sepulchral silence of her room in the mansion. The next morning, after a simple breakfast, Emily returned to the streets. She began to notice details of the city she had never noticed before, despite having lived there all her life. Street vendors setting up their stalls, the smell of fresh bread coming from bakeries, the buzz of workers heading to the subway. It was during this walk that she found the Morning Star Bakery. The modest establishment, with its foggy windows and worn sign, exuded an irresistible aroma of fresh bread and brewed coffee. "Would you like to try a fresh roll, young lady?" The voice came from a woman in her 50s who was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the bakery. Mrs. Amelia, as Emily would later discover her name to be, had warm brown eyes and a smile that seemed to embrace people. Emily touched the little money she still had in her pocket, hesitant. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Amelia added, "It's on the house. You look like you need a hearty breakfast." The interior of the bakery was cozy, with old but well-kept formica tables and a glass counter displaying various breads and pastries. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the space, bringing a sense of comfort that Emily had not felt since leaving home. While eating the bread with butter and drinking the café au lait, Emily couldn't contain the tears that silently flowed. They weren't just tears of sadness, but also of gratitude for that small gesture of kindness. Mrs. Amelia observed the young girl discreetly, her heart tight at seeing so much suffering in someone so young. There was something familiar about that girl, something that reminded her of her own daughter, whom she had lost years ago in a car accident. The same lost look, the same vulnerability, mixed with an inner strength still unknown. "Do you have somewhere to go?" asked Mrs. Amelia, sitting at the table with Emily. The young girl shook her head negatively, swallowing hard. "The shelter where I spent the night only allows one overnight stay." Mrs. Amelia remained silent for a few moments, as if fighting an internal battle. Finally, she said, "I have a vacant room above the bakery. It's nothing luxurious, but—" Emily looked up, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Are you offering me a place to stay?" "For now," replied Mrs. Amelia cautiously, "until you find a path. But with one condition: you'll need to help in the bakery. The work is hard. We start before sunrise." For the first time in days, a genuine smile illuminated Emily's face. "I accept. I've never worked before, but I promise I'll learn. I'll try my best." The first days at the bakery were a true test of endurance for Emily. Her delicate hands, accustomed only to holding silver cutlery and turning pages of expensive books, now faced the reality of manual labor. Blisters formed on her fingers as she learned to manipulate the dough, and her back ached from the effort of carrying flour sacks. Mrs. Amelia watched with a mix of concern and admiration at the young girl's determination. "Take it easy, child," she always advised whenever she saw Emily straining beyond her limit. "Pregnancy isn't an illness, but it's also not a time for excesses." The news of Emily's pregnancy didn't shock Mrs. Amelia as much as the young girl expected. "Life is made of surprises, some planned, others not so much," was her only comment when Emily, between tears, revealed her condition. Mornings at the bakery had their own routine, almost musical. The sound of dough being kneaded, the clinking of metal pans, the aroma of coffee being brewed. Everything mixed in a symphony that gradually became familiar to Emily. "The secret of bread isn't just in the recipe," Mrs. Amelia explained, while teaching Emily to knead the dough. "It's in the love you put into every movement, every fold of the dough. The bread feels when it's made with care." Emily absorbed each teaching with a thirst for learning that surprised even herself. Gradually, her hands developed the necessary muscle memory, and she began to understand the exact moment when the dough was at the right point, when the bread needed to go into the oven, what the ideal temperature was for each type of baked good. Regular customers of the bakery, initially suspicious of the presence of the unknown young girl, gradually surrendered to her dedication and shy smile. Mrs. Edith, an elderly woman who came every day to buy fresh French bread, was the first to notice Emily's pregnancy. "You need to eat well, girl," she would say, always setting aside an extra piece of cake for Emily. "A child needs a strong mother." However, not everyone was so understanding. Emily could hear the whispers and malicious comments from some customers when they thought she wasn't nearby. "A girl that age, pregnant. What a shame," some would say. "Mrs. Amelia shouldn't be sheltering that kind of person," others would murmur. Mrs. Amelia, however, faced the criticism with the same firmness with which she faced life. "Those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones," she would respond dryly when someone dared to make a negative comment in her presence. Nights were the most difficult times for Emily. Alone in the small room above the bakery, her thoughts inevitably returned to her old life. She found herself wondering if her parents missed her, if at any moment they regretted the decision they had made. One particularly difficult night, when the nausea of pregnancy seemed worse than normal, Mrs. Amelia came up to the room bringing a chamomile and ginger tea. She found Emily curled up in bed, hugging an old photo of her family that she had managed to bring with her. "You know, Emily," Mrs. Amelia began, sitting on the edge of the bed, "I lost my daughter, Anna Louise, 5 years ago. She was your age when she passed away." Her eyes filled with contained tears. "Since then, the bakery has been my only company, until you arrived." Emily held the woman's hand, feeling the rough texture from years of work. "Why did you help me, Mrs. Amelia?" "Because sometimes God takes something precious from us, but gives us the chance to do differently with someone else," she replied, wiping away a tear. "You remind me so much of Anna Louise, the same strength hidden behind frightened eyes." That night, something changed in the relationship between the two. They were no longer just employer and employee, or even benefactor and protected. Their deeper bond began to form, nurtured by the mutual understanding of two souls who knew the pain of loss. Emily began to dedicate herself even more to the bakery, not just out of gratitude, but from a genuine desire to make that place prosper. Her timid suggestions for new products were well received by Mrs. Amelia, who watched with satisfaction the young girl's enthusiasm. "We could make decorated cupcakes," suggested Emily one day, remembering the confectionery classes she had taken as a hobby in her old life. "And maybe special coffee, those with designs in the milk." Mrs. Amelia smiled, seeing in Emily's eyes the sparkle of enthusiasm that she hadn't seen in herself for so long. "Then we'll learn together," she replied, already planning the necessary changes. The noise of the first thunders woke Emily even before the usual time. Her belly, now visible at 5 months of pregnancy, made it more difficult to find a comfortable position to sleep. Through the window of the small room, she could see the dark clouds that gathered in the Chicago sky, heralding a strong storm. She went down the stairs carefully, finding Mrs. Amelia already in full activity in the bakery. The smell of yeast and fresh coffee filled the environment, but something was different that morning. The worried countenance of the woman revealed that something was not well. "Mrs. Amelia, has something happened?" The woman sighed, handing Emily a letter that had just arrived. It was a notification from the City Hall, warning about irregularities in the bakery's operating license. Additionally, there was a series of requirements to adapt to the most recent sanitary standards. "I don't know where I'm going to get the money for all these reforms," confessed Mrs. Amelia, passing her hand over her tired face. "The bakery is barely supporting itself in recent months." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. She knew that her presence had driven away some of the more conservative customers who didn't look favorably on a pregnant teenager working in the establishment. But now, seeing the concern on her benefactor's face, she realized that the situation was even more serious. "How much time do we have to make the adjustments?" asked Emily, already mentally calculating possible solutions. 30 days, replied Mrs. Amelia, discouraged, and the inspector made it very clear that there will be no extension. Emily spent the entire day thinking while serving customers and preparing bread. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind was buzzing with ideas. At night, after the bakery closed, she presented her plan to Mrs. Amelia. "What if we transformed the bakery into something more modern, more attractive, to a different audience?" suggested Emily, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. "We can maintain the essence of the place, but add elements that attract people willing to pay a bit more for special products." Mrs. Amelia listened attentively as Emily unfolded her plan. The young girl talked about creating a space for gourmet coffee, introducing a line of artisanal breads and elaborate sweets, transforming the environment with a welcoming but contemporary decoration. "But that will cost much more than just the adaptations required by the City Hall," considered Mrs. Amelia. Emily took a deep breath before making her next proposal. I have a bank account that my father opened before sending me away. I never wanted to use this money, but now..." Mrs. Amelia widened her eyes, understanding the dimension of what Emily was offering. "I can't accept it, child. That money is yours. It's for your future, for your baby." "You gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go," replied Emily with tears in her eyes. "You taught me the value of work. You treated me like family. Let me reciprocate, please." After much discussion, they reached an agreement. They would use part of Emily's money as an investment, turning her into a minority partner in the business. The renovations began immediately, and for 2 weeks the bakery operated partially, with only essential sales. Emily surprised everyone with her knowledge about gastronomic trends and business management, reminiscences of her previous life that now found a real purpose. Each decision was discussed together with Mrs. Amelia, who gradually became enthusiastic about the changes. The transformation went beyond the physical space. Emily dedicated herself to training the employees in customer service techniques, while Mrs. Amelia perfected her traditional recipes to create special versions. The old Formica counter gave way to a modern display case, and the walls received a soft aqua-green tone that made the environment more welcoming. On the day of the reopening, a line formed at the door of the bakery. The aroma of artisanal breads and special coffee attracted curious people and old customers, many of whom were positively surprised by the changes. Mrs. Edith, a loyal customer, was the first to try the new menu. "Now this is a change for the better," she declared loudly, making sure to be heard by everyone around. "And it hasn't stopped being our beloved Morningstar bakery." For Emily, seeing the smile on Mrs. Amelia's face as she served customers was worth more than all the money invested. The bakery wasn't just a business, it was a symbol of fresh starts, transformation, hope. At night, after closing on the first day of work in the new phase of the bakery, Mrs. Amelia hugged Emily tightly. "You're not just a force of nature, child," she said emotionally. "You're an angel that God put in my path." Emily caressed her belly, feeling the first movements of the baby, as if it too was celebrating that moment of victory. There, amid the aroma of fresh bread and coffee, she finally began to understand that family wasn't just a matter of blood, but of love and choices. The success of the new Morning Star bakery exceeded all expectations. In just a few months, the establishment became a beloved spot in the neighborhood, attracting not only local residents, but also people from other regions of the city, curious to know the place that was making such a success on social media. Emily, now with her 7-month belly very pronounced, coordinated the service with a mixture of grace and efficiency that impressed everyone. Her constant presence and welcoming smile had become a fundamental part of the identity of the place. One particularly busy morning, while organizing the pastry display case, Emily noticed a familiar figure across the street. Rose, her former housekeeper, was standing on the sidewalk observing the bakery with tears in her eyes. When their gazes met, the woman couldn't contain her emotion and hurriedly crossed the street. "My child," exclaimed Rose, carefully hugging Emily because of her belly. "For months I've been trying to find out where you are. Your parents, they don't know I'm here, but I needed so much to see you, to know if you're okay." Emily led Rose to a more reserved table where they could talk with privacy. Mrs. Amelia, sensing the situation, personally provided a tray with coffee and the bakery's special breads. "How did you find me, Rose?" "A client from the mansion commented about a bakery that had been renovated by a young pregnant woman," explained Rose, her eyes scanning every detail of Emily's face as if she wanted to make up for all the months of absence. "When I heard the story, my heart told me it could only be you." Rose told her that the Anderson Smith mansion was no longer the same since Emily's departure. Richard had immersed himself even more in work, spending entire days at the office. Helen, in turn, had withdrawn from social events, claiming health problems. "Your mother cries every day in your room," revealed Rose, holding Emily's hands. "But pride, that cursed pride prevents them from looking for you." Emily felt a lump in her throat. The pain of rejection was still there, but now it was different. It was no longer that acute and desperate pain of the first days. It had transformed into something deeper, more mature. "They lost the right to be part of my life when they abandoned me," said Emily, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "But you, Rose, you will always be welcome here." At that moment, the baby gave a particularly strong kick, making Emily smile. Rose, with tears in her eyes, asked permission to touch the young woman's belly. "It's a girl," revealed Emily, guiding Rose's hand to the spot where her daughter used to move the most. "I'm going to call her Laura." "Laura," repeated Rose, savoring the name. "It's a beautiful name, strong like you." Mrs. Amelia, who was discreetly observing the scene, approached with another pot of coffee. "Your Emily has become an extraordinary woman," she said to Rose, "and she will be a wonderful mother." The two women exchanged looks of mutual understanding, one who had cared for Emily in her privileged childhood, another who had welcomed her in her most vulnerable moment. Both sharing the love for that young woman who, against all odds, was flourishing. "Don't tell my parents where I am," Emily asked when Rose was preparing to leave. "Not yet. I need to do this my way in my own time." Rose promised to keep the secret, but before leaving she handed Emily a small package. Inside was a small light blue crocheted bootie, the first that Emily had worn as a baby. "I kept it all these years," explained Rose. "Now it belongs to your daughter." That visit awakened in Emily feelings she had tried to suppress. At night, alone in her room, she held the crocheted bootie against her chest and allowed herself to cry, not from sadness or anger, but from gratitude for her journey. "Your life will be different, my little one," she whispered to her belly. "You will be loved and accepted exactly as you are." At the bakery, the days continued to be intense. Emily had implemented an online ordering system that was very successful, especially for events. Her previous experience with social media proved valuable, and soon the Morning Star had a significant digital presence. "I never imagined our bakery would go so far," commented Mrs. Amelia one night as they were closing the cash register. "You transformed not just the business, but brought new life to everything." Emily smiled, thinking about how her own life had been transformed. From a spoiled girl to an independent woman, from a rejected daughter to a future mother, from a temporary guest to a partner in a thriving business. Each challenge, each obstacle had contributed to her growth. Laura's arrival into the world happened on a rainy September dawn. Emily was finishing the decoration of a wedding cake when she felt the first contractions. Mrs. Amelia, who had been on alert for days, immediately called a taxi and accompanied the young woman to the nearest public hospital. "Breathe, my child," Mrs. Amelia guided, firmly holding Emily's hand during the contractions. "You are strong, you'll make it." The hours that followed were intense. Emily, between one contraction and another, couldn't help but notice the irony of the situation. She, who had been born in one of the most expensive hospitals in Chicago, was now giving birth to her daughter in a public maternity ward. But the care and professionalism of the medical team made her feel welcomed and safe. "Let's go, Emily, one more push," encouraged the doctor, Dr. Rachel, who was attending the birth. "Your daughter is almost here." At 5:47 in the morning, Laura's strong cry echoed through the delivery room. The little one came into the world weighing 7 pounds, with dark hair and the same green eyes as her mother. When the nurse placed the baby in her arms, Emily felt an emotion she had never experienced before, an unconditional, pure, and overwhelming love. "Welcome, my little warrior," whispered Emily, gently kissing her daughter's forehead. Mrs. Amelia, watching the scene with tears in her eyes, felt her heart overflow with joy. The first days with Laura were an emotional roller coaster. Emily discovered that theories about motherhood were very different from practice. The sleepless nights, the doubts about breastfeeding, the crying that sometimes seemed impossible to soothe, everything was new and challenging. But she wasn't alone. Mrs. Amelia revealed herself to be a true surrogate grandmother, always present with practical advice and emotional support. The bakery employees took turns helping, allowing Emily to rest when necessary. "You need to eat right to have good milk," insisted Mrs. Amelia, preparing nutritious soups and whole grain breads, especially for Emily. A breastfeeding mother needs double the energy. Rose also became a constant presence, visiting whenever possible with small gifts for Laura. During one of these visits, she brought news that shook Emily. "Your mother found out you had the baby," Rose cautiously revealed. "An acquaintance saw you at the hospital and told her." Emily felt her heart tighten. "And how did she react?" "She cried a lot," replied Rose. "She spent hours looking at your old baby photos. Your father. Well, he continues to shut himself more and more into his work, but I noticed he's been keeping newspaper clippings about the bakery." The news provoked contradictory feelings in Emily. Part of her wanted her parents to know Laura, to see their granddaughter grow. Another part still carried the scars of abandonment, the fear of exposing her daughter to the same kind of rejection she had suffered. Laura grew strong and healthy, charming everyone with her easy smile and sweet personality. At 3 months, she was already the official mascot of the bakery, receiving cuddles and attention from regular customers. "She has your eyes," commented Mrs. Edith one day while admiring Laura in her baby carrier behind the counter. "But there's something in her smile that reminds me of Mrs. Amelia." Emily smiled, watching her daughter play with a rattle. It was true. Laura had inherited characteristics, not only genetic, but also from the loving environment in which she was growing. The bakery was her home, the employees and customers her extended family. Over time, Emily developed a routine that allowed her to balance motherhood with work. She improvised a small space at the back of the bakery that served as a nursing and resting area. Laura adapted perfectly to the rhythm of the place, her deepest sleep lulled by the familiar aroma of fresh bread. "You know, Emily," said Mrs. Amelia one night, as they watched Laura sleep, "when I lost my Anna Louise, I thought I would never be able to feel true joy again. But you and Laura, you brought light back into my life." Emily hugged the woman who had become her second mother. "You saved us, Mrs. Amelia. You gave us a home when we needed it most." The two women remained there, in silence, watching Laura's peaceful sleep. On the street, the city continued its frantic rhythm. But inside that small apartment above the bakery, time seemed to flow differently, sweeter, gentler. Emily took the crocheted bootie that Rose had given her and placed it next to Laura in the crib. It was a bridge between her past and her present, a reminder that even the most difficult stories can have new chapters full of hope. The years passed like pages of a book being turned by the wind. Laura grew surrounded by the love of the family. That fate had provided her, transforming into a smart and caring girl. At 12 years old, she was already known by everyone in the neighborhood as the little baker of the Morning Star, always experimenting with new recipes in the bakery's kitchen under the watchful eye of her mother and Mrs. Amelia. The Morning Star Bakery had transformed into one of the most beloved establishments in the area. Emily, now 26, had managed to expand the business, transforming it into a reference in artisanal confectionery. The small original space gave way to a charming two-story cafe bakery where Mrs. Amelia's traditional recipes harmoniously coexisted with Emily's contemporary creations. "Mum, look what I invented," exclaimed Laura on a Saturday afternoon, proudly presenting a cupcake decorated with fondant flowers she had made herself. Her dark hair was tied in a messy bun, and flower stains marked her freckled face. Emily observed her daughter's creation with a smile on her lips. It was impossible not to see herself reflected in that girl. The same passion for confectionery, the same sparkle in the green eyes when creating something new. But Laura had something that Emily hadn't had in her childhood: the freedom to be herself. "It's beautiful, my love," Emily praised, hugging her daughter. "Grandma Amelia will love to see this." Mrs. Amelia, who at 63 maintained the same energy as always, had become the grandmother that Laura never had. Her relationship with Emily had also deepened over the years, transforming into a bond that went far beyond the professional partnership. "This girl has a gift," Mrs. Amelia frequently commented, watching Laura work in the kitchen, just like her mother. Life had found its rhythm. Mornings started early, with the preparation of breads and pastries. Laura went to school in the afternoon, always returning in time to help with the last batches of the day. Nights were reserved for homework, shared stories, and plans for the future. However, not everything was rosy. Emily still carried in her heart the weight of her parents' choices. Rose continued to be her only link to the past, bringing sporadic news of the Anderson-Smith family. Through her, Emily had learned that her father was facing health problems and that her mother had become a more reserved person, less concerned with appearances. "Your mother keeps all the news articles about the bakery," Rose told during one of her visits. "She's proud of you, Emily, even if she doesn't know how to show it." Laura, curious like any child, frequently asked about her other grandparents. Emily always tried to be honest, but gentle in her responses, explaining that some families were different and that sometimes people needed a lot of time to learn how to deal with their mistakes. One day, while organizing the bakery's photo album, Laura found an old photo of Emily with her parents, taken at some social event years ago. "They look so serious," observed Laura, studying the image. "They're not like Grandma Amelia." Emily hugged her daughter, feeling a mixture of emotions. "Not all people know how to show love in the same way, dear, but that doesn't diminish the love we have for each other." The success of the Morning Star had become news in various local publications. A magazine specialized in gastronomy did a special feature on the establishment, highlighting the story of overcoming behind the business. The report brought a new wave of customers, curious to know the place that had transformed a story of rejection into one of success and welcoming. "You've built something extraordinary here," said a journalist during an interview. "What's the secret?" Emily looked around, at Mrs. Amelia, who was teaching Laura to make her famous cinnamon roll, at the employees, who were more like a family, at the regular customers, who knew each one by name. "The secret is understanding that family isn't just a matter of blood," she replied. "It's about choosing to stay, choosing to love, choosing to start over every day." At night, after the last customer had left and Laura was already asleep, Emily would go up to the bakery's terrace, her favorite place to think. From there, she could see the city lights, so different from those she observed from the window of her old room in the Anderson-Smith mansion. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and the Morning Star Bakery was closed for a special event, the celebration of Mrs. Amelia's 70th birthday. Emily and Laura had spent the entire week planning every detail of the surprise party, from the decoration to the special menu. "Do you think Grandma Amelia will like it?" asked Laura, adjusting for the 10th time the flower arrangement on the main table. Her green eyes, so similar to her mother's, sparkled with expectation. Emily smiled, admiring the work they had done. The bakery was unrecognizable, transformed into a welcoming celebration space. Flower garlands hung from the ceiling, elegantly decorated tables occupied the space, and a photo exhibition told the story of the bakery and its owner over the years. "She'll love it, my love," replied Emily, hugging her daughter, "especially because you made all the desserts." The sound of the door opening made both of them turn, expecting to see Rose, who had gone out to distract Mrs. Amelia. However, who entered was an elegant woman with grey hair, Helen Anderson Smith, Emily's mother. Time seemed to freeze. Emily felt her heart accelerate while Laura, sensing her mother's sudden tension, squeezed her hand tightly. "Emily!" Helen's voice trembled. Her eyes, marked by expression lines deeper than Emily remembered, alternated between her daughter and granddaughter. I saw about the party in the neighborhood newspaper." The silence that followed was dense, laden with 13 years of unspoken words. Helen took a hesitant step forward, her hands nervously twisting. "Your father," she began, but her voice failed. She took a deep breath before continuing. "Your father is in the hospital, his heart. The doctors don't know how much time." Emily felt her legs weaken. Laura, demonstrating a maturity beyond her 12 years, pulled a chair for her mother to sit down. "You must be my grandmother," said Laura, breaking the tense silence. Her voice was firm, but gentle. "I'm Laura." Helen covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her now makeup-free face. "You look so much like your mother," she whispered. At that moment, the door opened again, and Mrs. Amelia entered, followed by Rose. The older woman stopped abruptly upon perceiving the scene before her, her festive face transforming into a mask of concern. "Emily, dear," began Mrs. Amelia, moving instinctively to protect the one she considered her daughter. "It's all right, Mrs. Amelia," said Emily, standing up. Her eyes never left her mother's. "Did you come for the party?" Helen seemed confused for a moment, then noticed the decoration around her. "No, I just needed to see you. Needed to tell you so many things." "Grandma Amelia," called Laura, once again demonstrating her unique sensitivity. "Don't you want to show my other grandmother the old photos of the bakery?" "There are some of Mum when she first arrived here." Mrs. Amelia hesitated for a moment, but a look from Emily reassured her. The two older women moved away towards the photo mural, leaving mother and daughter with a moment of privacy. "Why now?" "Mom?" asked Emily, her voice carrying the weight of years of abandonment. Helen sat down, her hands trembling as she took an envelope from her purse. "Your father. He wrote this for you. Several letters, actually, over the years. He never had the courage to send them." Emily carefully took the envelope as if it could burn her fingers. Inside, she found dozens of letters, some yellowed by time, all addressed to her. "He always loved you, Emily," continued Helen, her voice choked. "We both loved you, but pride, appearances, society's pressure, we let all that be more important than our love for you. It was the biggest mistake of our lives." Laura returned at that moment, bringing a tray with 3 cups of coffee and some of the desserts she had prepared especially for the party. Grandma Amelia said that hot coffee helps heal old wounds, she said, placing the tray on the table. "And these are salted caramel coffee brigadeiros. I made them myself." Helen tried a brigadeiro and her tears began to fall again. "It's delicious, dear," she said, looking at her granddaughter with admiration. "You have a special gift. Just like Mom," replied Laura with pride. "She taught me everything I know." Emily observed the interaction between her daughter and her mother, feeling a confused mixture of emotions. The pain was still there, the scars of abandonment had not magically disappeared. But there was also something new, a possibility of healing that she hadn't expected to find. The afternoon sun entered through the windows of the Morning Star Bakery, illuminating the hall filled with guests who celebrated not only Mrs. Amelia's birthday, but also a moment of reconciliation that no one had predicted. The tables were occupied by a curious mixture of people, old customers, employees, neighborhood friends, and for the first time in 13 years, members of the Anderson Smith family. Helen, still visibly emotional, observed her daughter and granddaughter interacting with the guests. Emily had transformed into a strong and determined woman, so different from the frightened teenager who had left the mansion years ago. Laura, in turn, circulated among the tables with the ease of someone who grew up surrounded by love and confidence. "She's extraordinary, isn't she?" said Mrs. Amelia, sitting beside Helen. "Your daughter. She transformed not just this bakery, but the lives of everyone who knows her." Helen wiped away a discreet tear. You did for her what I should have done. I can never thank you enough." Mrs. Amelia smiled gently. "There's nothing to thank me for. Emily and Laura brought as much light into my life as I may have brought into theirs. That's how a true family works. Everyone grows together." In the center of the hall, Laura climbed onto a small improvised platform, drawing the attention of those present. In her hands, she held a leather-bound photo album. "Grandma Amelia," she began, her voice clear and confident, "this is our gift to you. Mum and I spent months collecting photos and stories from everyone who has passed through the Morning Star over all these years. Because you're not just the owner of the bakery, you're the heart of this place." Emily joined her daughter carrying an elaborate cake they had prepared together, a work of art in 3 tiers decorated with sugar flowers that replicated Mrs. Amelia's favorites. "When I arrived here," continued Emily, her voice choked with emotion, "I was just a frightened girl, carrying not only a baby, but also the weight of abandonment and rejection. You taught me that family isn't just a matter of blood, it's about daily choices of love and acceptance." Her eyes met her mother's in the audience. Helen, who had always been so controlled in public, made no effort to hide the tears that freely ran down her face. "And today," continued Emily, "I want to celebrate not only the birthday of the woman who welcomed me as a daughter, but also the possibility of new beginnings. Because true love, the kind that doesn't demand, that doesn't judge, that just accepts and cares, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds." Laura, perceiving the delicate moment, took Helen's hand and led her to where her mother and Mrs. Amelia were. The 3 generations of women met in an emotional embrace, while the guests applauded. "There's enough room in this family for everyone who wants to be part of it," declared Mrs. Amelia, her voice carrying the wisdom of years. "Love only multiplies, never divides." In the days that followed, Emily finally found the courage to read her father's letters. Each page revealed the regret of a man who had allowed pride and social conventions to override the love for his only daughter. The last letter, written from the hospital, contained a simple request: "Forgive us, daughter, not for our mistakes, but so that you yourself can move forward in peace." The Morning Star Bakery continued to grow, now with a new dynamic. Helen became a regular presence, gradually learning to be a grandmother, rediscovering her daughter, and building a relationship, with Laura based not on social obligations, but on genuine affection. On a particularly busy morning, while Laura was teaching her grandmother Helen how to make brigadeiros, to the amusement of all who watched the elegant lady fumbling with the chocolate, Emily observed the scene with Mrs. Amelia. "You know," said Emily, "for a long time I thought that forgiving meant forgetting the past. Now I understand that it's about creating space for a different future." Mrs. Amelia smiled, embracing the one whom fate had given her as a daughter. "Life is like making bread, my dear. Sometimes the dough doesn't rise as we expect. Sometimes it burns a little at the edges, but there's always the chance to start a new batch with more wisdom and love." Outside, Chicago continued its frantic rhythm, but inside the Morning Star Bakery, time followed a different beat, marked by spontaneous hugs, sincere laughter, and the eternally comforting aroma of fresh bread, reminding everyone who entered there that there is always room for new beginnings.